Well, welcome back again. In this video, we're going to continue thinking about the biblical doctrine of creation, looking specifically at the creation narrative found in the book of Genesis. Now, a couple words of caution before we get very far along here. Be aware that Moses' primary purpose for writing this text, Genesis 1 and 2, was theological, not scientific. He wants to highlight the nature of God over against the false gods of Egypt, from which the slaves had just been freed, and the false gods of the Canaanites, where they're heading into the future. So Moses is not interested in answering all of our scientific questions. Moses also uses what is known as parallelism to make his case. For example, day 1 describes the creation of the lights. Let there be light. Yet it's not until day 4 that we get the creation of the specific lights, the sun and the moon. Day 2, we see the separation of the sky from the water. Day 5, we see the creation of the animals that would live in those spaces. Day 3, we see the land separated from water. Day 6, we see the creation of the animals that would live on the land. That is certainly parallelism. And in fact, that is arguably poetic. Some have argued that means Moses is not trying to offer a literal account of the creation. He's being artistic all the way across the board. That is not necessarily the case. Besides, why couldn't Moses arguably be creative and factual at the same time? As it turns out, the argument about the so-called theory here connected to this notion that it is artistic does nothing to change the fact that Moses believes what he's writing, and so did the early audiences of his books. We also have to think along the lines here in terms of, was there one creation story? Some have argued there are 2 creation stories in Genesis, and occasionally even hear somebody argue for 3. I'm going to dismiss the 3 creation account. It's very rare. Such people want to argue that Genesis 1:1 describes one creation story. Genesis 1:3 to 2:3 describes another, following in the gap. And then they'll argue that Genesis 2:4 and the rest of chapter 2, highlighting the creation of Adam, is a 3rd creation story. 3 different events, 3 different sequences. Instead, more popular would be the argument for 2 creations. One option is verse 1 of chapter 1 is one creation account, and the rest of Genesis chapter 1 is another, or some slight variation of that. I want to proffer what has been the more historical position, that there is just one creation account given. What we have here is arguably 3 different descriptions of the one creation. So for example, in Genesis 1:1, where it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," that is a summary statement of all of creation. Then beginning in chapter 1 verse 3, all the way through chapter 2 verse 3, Moses is giving a more detailed explanation of the creation day by day. And then what happens in chapter 2, beginning at verse 4, is a detailed explanation of just one part of the creation described in chapter 1, that is the creation of man, something that was described on day 6. So my contention is there's one creation account, maybe 1 or 2, 3 at most, detailed explanations of what happened. I liken it to looking at something from far, far away. When you see it from a distance, you can see all the stuff, but you can't tell much about the details. That would be chapter 1, verse 1. If you get a telescope, you can zoom in on more details, see what's happening, but not all the nitty-gritty little details. That would be days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 found in chapter 1. And then compare that to what it would look like if you pulled out a microscope and looked at minuscule, minute details in that. That would be arguably what's happening in Genesis chapter 2. So I believe it's one creation account, 3 different views of it. God did it, here's how he did it, and then chapter 2 with the creation of man, why he did it. So let's work our way quickly through the text and kind of see some of the highlights of what Moses is communicating here. In this larger creation account that describes the creation in general, what you'll notice in chapter 1, verse 1 is that in the beginning, God created. In the Hebrew, it's Bereshith bara Elohim. God created in the beginning. Only God, biblically speaking, creates. And the way it's described in verse 1 is describing a God who, in the beginning, with nothing available to him other than his own power and majesty, created the entire universe based on his own will out of nothing. He created it, as theologians say, ex nihilo, out of nothing. All the other pagan gods of Egypt or the Canaanites all have gods who are involved in the creation, but their gods need the help of other gods. One god has sexual relations with another, and thus the creation and so forth. Moses is painting a picture where the God of the Hebrews is so mighty that he can do it entirely on his own out of nothing. I encourage you to write these texts down and look them up later. We don't have time to do it now. But look up Psalm number 33, verses 6 and 9. This will affirm what's being described here. John 1:3 follows this suit. Colossians 1:16. Hebrews 11, verse 3, as well as Revelation chapter 4, verse 11. All emphasize the fact that God and God alone did it out of nothing. We also notice as we look at Genesis chapter 1 that God created with the spoken word. That is king language. That's royalty being described. Think of any movie you may have ever seen with Knights of the Round Table or the old Ten Commandments movie with Charlton Heston. When the king wanted something done, he didn't do it himself. He spoke it, let it be, and somebody made it happen. What that is a picture of divine authority over all creation. When God wanted light, he just said, let there be light. And there was. And so God is being created, or presented, that is, as the sovereign creator of the universe, doing what he wants, how he wants, and he's doing it sovereignly like a king, speaking it into existence. Now, we could debate all day, what about the lights on day 1 and the sun and the moon on day 3? I think that's easily explained. Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 said, God, let there be light, and there was light, but no explanation of what those lights are. You need to look at a parallel text in Revelation chapter 21, verse 23. There, John, describes the bookend to the creation account. If the creation of the account starts the Bible, John's recreation, the new heavens and the new earth account, ends the Bible. And in that passage, Revelation 21, 23, John describes the new heavens and the new earth as having no sun or moon or stars, but that the light comes from God himself. And so theologically speaking, we might argue that when God said, let there be light, and there was, but there were no sun, moon, or stars, that what God has decreed is let the creation see me and my glory shining on them. Likewise, we could think about what does the word day mean? As I mentioned in the previous video, this day age, that Hebrew word yom, which can mean 24-hour time period, a period during the daylight hours of a day, or a long period of time like back in the day. In Genesis 1, that word yom, day, is repeatedly used to describe a 24-hour period of time, based on, by the way, the lunar cycle. Genesis 1, 5, 8, 13, 19, 23, and 31 all described, and that was the first day, the second day, and it's always described as a 24-hour day period. There was evening, and then there was morning. There was night, and there was daytime. Day 1. This is how the Israelites chose to interpret Yom. They understood that their calendar, their day, begins at sunset. There was evening, and then there was day. So the early Hebrews, the early audience of Moses' writing, they read it as a literal 24-hour period a day. What do we say about the theory of evolution? Well, notice again in Genesis chapter 1 that when God created animals particularly, he created them specifically, not generically. What I mean is, repeatedly we're told that God created these various animals after their own kind. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 11. Twice in chapter 12, verse 20, or chapter 1, verse 12. Twice in that. Once in Genesis 1:21. Twice again in verse 24. When God created the animals, he created them after their own kind. He says the same thing about humans as well. Cows are cows. Camels are camels. Man is man. It doesn't allow for an evolutionary account to explain how man came to be. God created man uniquely. In fact, that's what I think the highlight of the whole story is in the first place. Beyond trying to prove that God is the God, the supreme God of the universe, I think Moses' other primary theological point is the high point of creation being mankind. Not only is man created in the image of God, something not ascribed to any other created being, and we find it twice in 2 verses in a row, chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. We also notice, we pay close attention in Genesis 1, that as God creates the various days, they get various amounts of verses ascribed to them. The day that gets the most attention out of the entire creation account is day 6. And when you look at day 6, the creation feature, the highlight of it that gets the most attention is the creation of man. Man is the highlight of all creation, and that's because he's been created in the image of God. Created specifically by God to be like God, and I would argue so that we can relate with God. In the same way that I can't talk to a snake because I'm not them and they're not me, we're not of the same kind, we would have a difficult time speaking to God unless he had either condescended to come down among us like one of us, Jesus in the incarnation, or created us to be like him for the purpose of relationship. And so when God makes Adam, literally the name Adam means man, he created him in his image, not symbolically, but literally. Jesus and the disciples believe in a literal man named Adam. Sin is attributed to that man named Adam in Romans chapter 5. And even the Human Genome Project, a massive modern day scientific experiment trying to track the DNA of all humans on the planet, has argued that, at least in the Western Hemisphere, that all humans share a common mother. Somewhere back in history, our DNA traces back to a common root. Arguably, of course, that would be Noah's wife, because she's the mother of Noah's sons, who then repopulate the earth after the flood. But we can go back even further. We know the common mother is Eve. Evolution is ruled out. God's special act of creation is ruled in. And all that because it ultimately meant to reflect God's nature. At the end of day 6, God surveyed all that he created, and according to Genesis 1:31, he saw that it, like him, was very good. Paul in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, talks about what we can know about God, even things about his invisible attributes. Some of the things we talked about previously have been made evident to us in the creation. God has created the universe in such a way that we can see God and know God. And to deny the creation account denies the reliability and clarity of Scripture. It describes the creation in such a way that you either believe it and support Moses' purposes, that God's greater than all these other gods, or it undermines Moses' purposes, and there's no purpose for it otherwise. Lots to think about, lots to ponder. I encourage you, start with Scripture, and then let the Bible drive your understanding of everything else.